Hello, everyone, and welcome to the March 2023 forecast with myself, Gary O'Toole. You can find me at timelineiastrology.com. Let's get into the month. First, let's chant for Ganesh, the Lord of Vedic astrology. Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. Om Gang Ganapataye Namah. A reminder that I use the sidereal zodiac, sidereal calculations, meaning fixed stars, even though they're not exactly fixed. They're more fixed than the signs of the zodiac that most astrologers use, especially in the West, the tropical signs. So you have to actually subtract 24 degrees currently, according to most calculations, most astrologers' calculations, that is, who use the sidereal zodiac to obtain your sidereal chart. So 24 degrees from current calculations to get your sidereal chart. Reminder, though, that your circumstances, i.e. in the Vedic chart, these are calculated using dashas, planetary, as well as sign-based cycles. Your progress chart, in other words, is more important than transits. Whatever about transits applying to everybody's life in some way or other, because it all, is happening at the same time for all of us in terms of the transits. We all experience these transits in different ways individually, according to our own blueprint. But even moreover than that, transits are not as important as these dashes. So whatever planetary cycle you're in and the signs that are active in your chart is more important than the transits in those signs, although that's important in terms of triggers to those particular circumstances. So your birth chart, in other words, is more important. Let's get into March, because I do think March is going to be one of those months that we're going to see in 2023 as a key turning point and a new era that we're really starting. And of course, in the Vedic calendar, March is important because we have the new moon, which is a new lunar year. So the new lunar year chart for March is going to be an important one for the year ahead until the next new moon in Pisces, sidereal Pisces, in April of 2024. So this is a big deal. So for that reason alone, March is a big deal. But apart from that, there are other things going on, I think, that make March a big deal. So this thing is happening in March and has been happening for some weeks, where all of these planets, including the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter, as well as Neptune, are all moving through Pisces. Neptune moves through Pisces for many years until 2036, 37. So that's 14 years of Neptune in Pisces now, which began in February of 2023. But Jupiter is finishing its transit in Pisces by the end of April. So March is the last sort of full month of Jupiter in Pisces. Venus is starting the month of March in Pisces in exaltation, conjoined Jupiter. So that's a nice, you might say, quote unquote, nice transit. And maybe too nice and maybe too good in many ways, an overindulgent combination, Venus and Jupiter. And Mercury is going to move in as well in March. And that's not so nice because Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter are all the nice planets, all the benevolent planets, as they're called. It's too much of a good thing in a way. And it's also complicated by being hemmed in between Saturn and Rahu. So Saturn's on one side in Aquarius and Rahu's on the other side in Aries, hemming in all of these planets that move through Pisces. And therefore, it's a kind of like overindulging because of their stresses going on around us, being stuck in some way, not being able to move forward, and yet at the same time not being able to move back. And because of that, feeling this sort of need to then overindulge or even just trip out in some way. This is the indication of Pisces. And especially when you have Neptune conjoined all of these planets here. Mercury is the least favored in this particular sign because Mercury is the intellect, the mind, the analytical nature of the mind and its, ability to rationalize something. And Mercury in Pisces cannot, because you cannot rationalize what's happening in Pisces. It's all just too abstract and too mystical and metaphysical for the mind. And so we feel a bit lost when Mercury goes into Pisces. But when it joins, Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces, there can be this great sense of connection as well to something greater than the intellect, than the mind itself can actually fathom. And so it can be profound and very creative, and that's all very positive in that way. But again, because all of these planets hemmed in between Saturn and Rahu, whatever stressors that you're experiencing personally in your life, whatever area of your life these signs represent, you might likely just feel a bit sort of frazzled by it all at this stage. And again, because of the possibility of overindulging, and even if it's just overindulging an idea, a fantasy in your mind, you could also lead to this sort of like tuning out, daydreaming and tripping out on some sort of fantastical idea that actually leads to a problem. So this is just something to be mindful of overall, despite, again, like I said, having all of these nice quote unquote planets in Pisces in great strength with Venus and Jupiter. The Mercury weakness in Pisces can bring down the mood somewhat. And again, so whether it's you overindulging an idea and then tripping out and then not really being on it, or you overindulging your senses and then your mind being dull, if you drink or eat too much, for example, whatever it might be that you overindulge, an ideal, a Jupiter ideal, the kind of fantastical Jupiter ideal with Neptune, especially, where the details aren't clear right now. All of that means that, you could overdo it and then create problems. So that's the kind of thing to be mindful of in March. Now, Jupiter, while it's transitioning from Pisces into Aries by the end of April, is also moving into combustion because, like I said, the sun is going to go into Pisces, and the sun then by April will conjoin Jupiter, and this is its combustion. So into March, the end of March, we're going to feel this. And what does the Jupiter combustion feel like at the end of Pisces? Well, like the picture suggests, it's a bit like, okay, we're coming up for air and we can see the light, but it's like we've got to navigate through this kind of tricky terrain now underwater. So if you've ever gone deep sea diving and you've gone having to go through these sort of ravines or something underneath the water, it's a bit tricky. You have to be really careful, of course, as you kind of navigate all of this and then come up for air. And, without getting lost in this particular analogy, basically, we do have to manage this sort of tricky juncture right now. And Jupiter, when it's combust, means that we cannot see it. And I just want to share a personal story that I was on the beach recently, and there was this guy who'd set up his telescope, an astronomer who'd set up a telescope pointed at Jupiter. And so I just sat there in awe, really looking at Jupiter, and could make out all of its lines, even its spirals, its yellowish tinge, and its three moons, and three of its moons at least. And it was just awe-inspiring, I have to say. It just to be able to see Jupiter with the eye, through a telescope was a fascinating thing. And there's that, but there's, again, reason I'm mentioning that is because Jupiter now isn't not going to be visible in the next few weeks. And so when you cannot see Jupiter, you don't have that awe and inspiration necessarily out there in the outer world. Most likely, you're going to sense or see a lack of what inspires, and actually even a lack of what seems right. Because when a planet is combust, when we can't see it, we cannot see the outer significations of Jupiter, i.e., the right thing, seeing people do the right thing, seeing, something that inspires, that is awe-inspiring and magic even. We have to, though, look within for that. And in fact, when we do that, we can see it more. So that's really essentially what combust planets suggest, is that the more we look in for that, in this case, Jupiter, and the inspiration and intuition, and that sense of what is right for us individually moving forward, the more we can tap into that inner strength of Jupiter, the more we look out there for answers, for somebody who's going to be our savior. And the savior archetype is certainly indicated here with Jupiter combust in Pisces. There is no savior out there. There's nobody out there that's going to save you at this point. It's all an inside job. You are your own savior. Look within, find that strength within, find that intuition. So the other thing that's happening is that Rahu has just moved into the lunar mansion at the very beginning of sidereal Aries called Ashvini. Ashvini, the horsewoman, is one translation, but its symbol is a horse. And it's ruled by the physicians to the gods, the Ashvini Kumaras, and they are the horse-headed gods, the physicians. And it's all about movement as well and healing. Now, this is complex, though, because Ashwini, though it's very much in very impulsive, very sort of gung-ho, sort of movement-orientated, swift, I call it the swift one. It's very fast, and it's great in the sense that things can really happen really quickly. With Rahu Rahu is even more reckless and impulsive. And when you put these two together, it just becomes reckless and impulsive and brash. And that's a problem because it's in Aries, in the sign of war. And because Ketu, the south node, at the same time is transiting through Swati, which is associated with Rahu itself, and Rahu in Ashwini, which is associated with Ketu, we have this dynamic like here that's represented in the image of the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. In this case, it's a dragon, but you get the picture. Basically, we're caught in a loop here, and the loop here is a tricky one to get out of. And the loop in terms of the current war situation is one of the key things that's happening. So Rahu exaggerates, distorts, and creates this recklessness in Aries now, especially for these next few months in the summer, as it transits Ashwini, where very impulsive actions are taken. Again, in the context of the war in the world, that's not great news. In your own personal life, be mindful of it in terms of your own recklessness and impulsive behavior. And then at the same time, Ketu and the Swati, where it's this, lack of decorum even and lack of negotiation. And again, because they're associating with each other, like the serpent devouring its own tail, you end up devouring your own tail. You end up chasing your own tail. So anything that you want to do, be mindful of that you don't, think about really any impulsive actions that you take at this period leading to problems with other people, especially. And trying to sort of get out of this loop is about trying to understand the patterns, the repeating patterns over and over again in your life that these nodes, the north and south node, Rahu and Ketu, show. So if you've been doing something and your tendency to just slip back into that mode of being and doing it this certain way, this would be a good time to think about how to slip out of that, loop and that pattern that you've got going on for, probably your whole life. In the war context, this is a repeating pattern. And unfortunately, we're seeing this, obviously throughout history, we can see this pattern, and we're going to see this play out in very many, I would say, ways that feel like fated. There's that word, fated, when we talk about the nodes. And I think we're going to see things happen that feel fated, that feel out of control. And that things feel, while they feel fated and out of control, they feel very uncertain. And we just, again, don't know how to get out of it. It's a conundrum. We might personally be able to get out of our own loops or see the pattern at least. But globally, we're just going to see the pattern and the loop and this war loop go on. And it's going to be like a tape repeating itself, unfortunately. So that's one thing to say about the nodes. Speaking of Mars, though, because Mars rules where Rahu in Aries is right now, Rahu being that very volatile, impulsive, reckless behavior and moving things forward in many leaps and bounds in many ways, both positive and negative. Mars itself is moving signs as well in March. So that's more positive in one way, but it's also more negative in terms of the war. So the fact that Mars wasn't able to move forward in the last few months over the winter as it was retrograde in sidereal Taurus meant it got stuck. But now it's moving forward into new territory. That means that the war is going to move forward. Now, again, that's not so positive, right? The fact that it's activating certain things in the US chart as well, including Mars itself in Gemini, in the US chart, in sidereal Gemini, is a trigger for the US getting involved in the war. That's not so positive. But again, you always have to think about these things in terms of globally, collectively, and then also personally, individually. How do you experience Mars and Gemini? I can't go through that here with you, of course, but Mars and Gemini is at least moving things forward. That's, again, the more positive expression for this. Regardless of the war moving forward, you moving forward in any of your actions with Mars now finally making it out of Taurus after months, like 7 months in Taurus, in a sign it doesn't like to be in, where it gets really stuck in the mud, and then it went retrograde, stuck in the mud and moving backwards. that kind of scenario is not helpful for Mars. So if you're Mars ruled, or whatever Mars rules in your chart, whatever area of your life you experience Mars, it can now at least move forward. Now, it does have to then also go into Gemini, where it's having to negotiate and discuss things and talk about it more than it wants to. And then also, because Mercury is about to move into Aries as well in March, the latter part of March, we're then having this exchange as soon as Mars goes into Gemini by the latter part of March between Mars and Mercury. And so at least we might say, in the terms of the war, a more positive spin on this would be that Mars in Gemini and Mercury in Aries by the end of March is going to lead to some negotiations. There's some cooperation at least going on there. So that's more positive. And again, for your own personal life, that's also more positive. But again, depending on what signs that this represents, some signs are going to fare better than others. This is something I can't go through here. One other thing I want to point out, though, and this is, again, a huge complexity that's going on right now. And it showed, for example, the recent earthquakes in Turkey and in Syria, that showed, this is the signature here for that, around the full moon. That's when it happened. So we had the sun with Pluto and the moon opposite Pluto trigger when you trigger Pluto, which is already triggering the nodes, and the nodes themselves that trigger seismic activity like that, you're seeing this kind of indication. So this is a big signature for 2023. Pluto is squaring the nodes for most of the summer, and that is uncertain. That feels fated. Things feel like outside of our control. And at the same time, things feel like, or we might feel like we are being controlled by something. What's going on in the world? I mean, I'm not going to list all of the many things that are going on that feel like, really out of control right now, things that are bizarre even. But when we see Pluto and in a square to the lunar nodes in these warlike situations, that's one thing, the war. But the other thing is, what's going on even in our planet, in the inner core of our planet. This is bizarre in one way to think about it, but when you think about that, the planet Pluto is approximately the same size as the Earth's core. I think that's all I need to say about that. So you can read up on it. You can look at what's going on in terms of what's happening in on our planet, in the deep inner core of our planet, and how that's impacting our planet. That's one expression of, I think, many expressions that this could show, and I don't have time to go into it now because we could talk about this all day, but basically it shows a lot of uncertainty and change, deep inner change that's going on our planet, in our planet, literally, in our lives personally, and on the world stage. And it's going to feel for the rest of the year, pretty much, and especially in the summer months, things are like out of control. And things are conflicted. And that's what squares, and especially between these invisible planets, Pluto and the lunar nodes, represents. Things are outside of our control, feel fated, very uncertain, but at the same time, things are shifting, are changing in some key ways, and things are coming out of the woodwork like you wouldn't believe this summer. So that's a whole other. The other thing I want to mention is that Saturn, now settling into sidereal Aquarius, is going to move into the next lunar mansion in March. So it's a key shift, another key shift in March. You're going to hear a lot from Western astrologers who use the tropical zodiac about Saturn moving into tropical Pisces. You're also going to hear from Western astrologers using tropical about Pluto moving into Aquarius. So March, in that sense, is a key shift. Vedic astrology, sidereal astrologers have this at its core, and that is Saturn moving into Shatbishaj, the 100 healers, the 100 demons, the 100 faint stars in the middle of sidereal Aquarius, represents this new era in tech. It's really what makes Aquarius Aquarius. When we think about this lunar mansion, it's all about the kind of diffuse, confusing, but also the potentials, the possibilities that are here, again, in relation to tech, the humanistic movement, the even transhumanistic movement that's going on, the sort of connecting the dots in many other ways as well. But this is where 30 years ago we saw, civil rights movements, humanistic movements, Medicare and all of that in the US was a big movement. I do think that this is a key shift in March. And in terms of technology, in terms of human movements and on our planet also, but also humanistic movements and civil rights movements and social issues are going to move forward in a big way. It's not that there aren't going to be challenges around this, of course, because there are going to be many. And one of the key challenges that this lunar mansion represents is just like in Saturn in tropical Pisces, Saturn in this sidereal sign and in this lunar mansion, Shet is ruled by the god of the sea. So that's why you're going to hear from both sides of the different perspectives of tropical sidereal, this theme of the sea being a huge one for the next year, especially, but for many years, if we look at the transits. But really, we're going to see it kick in a big way in March. So what does that mean? It means a lot of water problems, a lot of flooding and droughts, a lot of water contamination. Need I remind you that Japan is about to release, I don't know how many millions of tons of nuclear waste into the ocean, and the consequences of that for the years to come is just mind-boggling. And that's what Saturn represents. Saturn represents the consequence of our actions, of our choices. And Saturn in a lunar mansion ruled by the god of the oceans is going to show the consequence. And so, yes, Shet is, you could say, 100 healers, but it often translates as 100 demons, 100 illnesses. So you need 100 healers to heal 100 illnesses. And so this has a lot of issues here when we combine it with the lunar nodes and their transits and so on, and their square to Pluto. Things coming out of the woodwork, but also coming out of the sea, coming out of this water contamination stuff. I mean, what happened in Ohio recently is another one, for example. What's going to happen in Japan in April, but other things as well. We're likely to see a lot of water problems. And of course, the most obvious example of this is, and an example of this, the last time Saturn was in this lunar mansion 30 years ago, was when the US had the longest on record hurricane. So obviously, storms are going to be a key thing this year. Massive storms, hurricanes, when that season hits, in whatever part of the world that hits in, we're going to see that as a big, big theme. So water damage, storm damage, water contamination, so on and so on. Major themes around water. So let's just, before I finish, look at the major lunations for March. So the full moon and the new moon. The full moon is important, but the new moon especially this month, because it's a new lunar year. So this is the full moon. This is somewhat conflicted, despite some of the more auspicious indications. You have the Venus coming to exaltation around this time, with the moon in a lunar mansion that is associated with Venus in Purva Falguni, the former fruitful one. It's what makes Leo, sidereal Leo, so creative and lustful also. But it's very much about creativity. It's very much about sexuality and sensuality. The fact that Venus is exalted 8 signs away is very sensual and sexual. Of course, Jupiter is not far from Venus itself, so there's a conflict there of interest, perhaps, in terms of sensual gratification versus more meaningful pursuits. Neptune is blurring the boundaries of all of that. The fact that the sun is in Aquarius with Saturn and Mercury, and that drier sign, you might say, despite it being the water barrier, it's a drier sign. It's more aloof and detached. Moon in Leo is very passionate and wants to express itself in a very dramatic way many times. And the fact that Saturn is opposite this moon, with Mars and the North Node Rahu aspecting this moon, therefore all 3 quote-unquote malefic planets aspecting this moon, it is a bit charged emotionally. And so again, it's another indication, like I started with at the top of this, that there's probably a tendency here for an overindulgent streak going on because of stressors that are going on also. So that's one thing I would say about this full moon. So let's go to the new moon, though, because a couple of weeks after that, that's, by the way, the full moon on March 7th. A couple of weeks after, we have the new moon on March 21st. And this is an important one because it's a new lunar year. Now, I've drawn this for London. It's the same rising sign for Dublin. It will be Virgo for much of Europe, which makes a big difference because it places all these planets, including the new moon, in the 7th house. For London and Ireland, Dublin, we have all of these planets in the 8th house. So depending on where you are, basically, it's going to have a big impact on where that lands in the chart. But just using, apart from the rising sign and placing this in house and looking at the specifics, just generally looking at this, there's some key indications here, including what I already mentioned, and that is that all of these planets, including the sun and moon, the new moon in Pisces, are hemmed in between Saturn and Rahu. So Saturn here is in sidereal Aquarius, Rahu in sidereal Aries. They're either side of all of these planets in Pisces. And so this combination is what's going to make the next year feel like we're stuck in a loop here. Going back to that image of the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, we're stuck in something. We can't move forward, but we can't move back. And when we try to move forward, we're like shown the past. And when we look back to the past, we're shown the future. We're stuck in a loop here, basically, in this year. But at the same time, there are some positive things going on for sure. But the positive things themselves might, again, be an overindulgence. Again, even if it's an overindulging a fantasy or an idea or an ideal, because of a stressor, because of it feeling stuck in some way that you can't go forward and you can't go back, and you are where you are, and you have to accept that. And maybe you cannot, and therefore then you might overindulge a fantasy. And that's oftentimes what we do. That's human nature. If you're in a situation you can't get out of, you might daydream. You might dream of something better. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying it's anything wrong with it. Again, except for that maybe you will indulge a fantasy and trip out on some unreality that actually doesn't serve you. Because there's an opportunity here as well to see something better, to kind of focus. Again, the word focus is important here, with Saturn in Aquarius, Rahu in Aries. So Saturn is looking at Rahu in Aries. Focus all of your energy and be able to see more positive, a more hopeful situation. Be more optimistic about something that, first of all, accepting where you're at and then working with where you're at to make something better. That's a general, I think, indication for this year ahead. And when I show you now what this lunar year, according to the Jupiterian, the Jovian year, represents, you can see that there's definitely some auspiciousness here for sure, but there's a lot of complexity as well. Now, the other thing to note here, a key thing, there's many things we can note, but Venus is exactly conjunct the North Node Rahu at 11 degrees of sidereal Aries. So that's, again, a signature for the whole year ahead. This means that there's going to be, I believe, major volatility in the global markets, in finances, all of that. The economy is impacted because of this Venus Rahu, but also relations. And again, in the sign of Aries, which is a war sign, we're obviously going to see the complexities that this war is bringing about on our planet. And again, we have to see that. We have to be mindful of that and not have a sort of, on the one hand, a sort of doom and gloom expectation of what is happening in terms of potentially a world war, but at the same time not trip out in fantasy and not deal with the reality, and then actually not be of use or any help to anyone or anything around us by, not addressing what is happening. So again, it's a balance that needs to be achieved here, I guess, between, looking to the future in a more optimistic way and not tripping out on some fantasy in a very sort of unrealistic way that doesn't help anyone or any situation at all. So again, a balance needs to be achieved, I would say. Let me finish with this. And this is the, again, this is called, quote unquote, Jovian year. So based on the transits of Jupiter and Saturn, would have this 60-year cycle. And so there are these 60 different years based on their transits. And this year, March 2023 until April next year, 24, we have this year that's called the Shobhakrita. Shobhana basically means luster, light, graceful and good. All of that sounds great and good, very auspicious, but this obviously cannot be the only thing to show that what's going on in the year. I showed you the yearly chart. You know, depending on where you are in the planet, it will show that there are some complexities going on for sure. Despite it being more auspicious and light and graceful, and all of that, a very Jupiterian kind of indication in many ways. Anyway, grace is Jupiter, good and light, that's very Jupiter. That light, that goodness, that grace is there, but there's also, again, like I said, this feeling stuck and maybe even tripping out on some sort of fantasy in our mind and not wanting to deal with what is actually happening on our planet, which, you know, if you've been following my posts, if you've been reading any of my articles, we are, it seems, heading to, I actually believe we already are in a world war, and it's going to escalate and de-escalate at various times over the years. But that's where we're at. We need to acknowledge that and then, you know, envision a better, brighter future in a way beyond the doom and gloom predictions, and for our own personal lives to imagine something better and to use that energy of what is a world war personally in our lives to actually transcend our own limitations with courage and conviction, with being more proactive and more positive without avoiding the negative, and to get beyond this sort of, you know, this or that sort of situation where, you know, this didn't work out, therefore, you know, I need to do something else in reaction to that. Instead, to transcend that thing that doesn't work or that you have to overcome and not get stuck in it, but to transcend it, to use it as a form, as a means to transcend to something better without rallying everything you have against that thing that's just not working out. So wherever you feel stuck, in other words, use it to transcend, use it to go beyond. Don't use it as an excuse to remain stuck. And that's essentially what I think the year is about. Basically, that's the year ahead. That's the month of March. It's a complex time we're moving into, folks. So if you want to join me on my platform, it's patreon.com /timeline astrology, or just go to timelineastrology.com and you'll find the links. I post daily reports on all of these transits, and I have monthly meetings with my patrons where we discuss these things. We have a conversation about them instead of me just presenting in this one way fashion. We can have a back and forth. Go to the websites, and if you can at least click the like button, I'd really appreciate it. Any comments that you have, any questions, please leave a comment, a question, and I'll do my best to answer if I can. And thank you for listening. I wish you all the best for the month ahead, and until next time.